Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for an interactive conversation with Carlton Turner of AlternateROOTS on living at the Nexus of Arts, Culture, and Social Justice. This is the second in a series of public talks about the arts as a form of civic engagement with the potential for transformative social change. The series is part of the Racial Equity and Arts Leadership Project initiated by the Metro Nashville Arts Commission as part of their plan to drive equity and inclusion in Nashville's cultural ecosystem. The other part of this project consists of a learning cadre in which leaders of arts institutions from across Nashville's cultural landscape meet and facilitate discussions investigating how racism operates in the cultural sector and creating a peer network dedicated to positive change. We at Vanderbilt University's Kirk Center for Arts, Enterprise, and Public Policy are honored to be part of this project, and we thank Metro Arts for offering us the opportunity. And I'd also like to say thank you to all of the leaders and representatives of arts and cultural institutions who are taking on this difficult, necessary, and transformational work, and to everyone who put the word out about this event tonight. While I'm on the thank yous, I'd like to thank the Noah Liff Opera Center for generously allowing us to use this beautiful space. Thank you, Noah. Also, thank you, Anne-Marie Mazzoni and Randy Williams of the Opera Center, and also Vanessa, who helped for all their invaluable assistance in putting this together. I also have to thank Heather Riccato, Rachel Skaggs, and Sierra McKissick of the Kirk Center and the rest of the Kirk Center staff for all of the time and care they put into this event. This evening, we're honored to have Carlton Turner joining us. Carlton's got a long history as an artist for social change, a convener and leader of community-based arts projects and cultural organizations, and a powerful advocate for the centrality of arts in public policy and in building an equitable world. Were I to actually stand here and list the art projects, education initiatives, boards, panels, performances, albums, arts festivals, and events that he's directly responsible for, never mind the national foundations and groups that he's advised, it would take far too long and prevent you from actually hearing from him tonight. So I'm going to hit some highlights. Currently, Carlton is the executive director of AlternateROOTS, which is a regional arts organization that has truly national impact in this field. It supports and facilitates the work of artists and cultural organizers in creating and presenting art aimed at social transformation. This is only the most recent step in a long career as an artist and organizer who brings the arts and cultural practice to bear on the pressing social issues we are confronting in our city, our nation, and our world. He's the co-founder and director of Mugabe, Men Under Guidance Acting Before Early Extinction, a performing arts group that in the last 2 years alone has produced 3 separate performance arts projects commissioned by the National Performance Network, plus a community engaged performance piece commissioned by the August Wilson Center for African American Culture, and a 3-year project with the Atlanta dance company Moving in the Spirit and poet Alice Lovelace. Carlton's also on the board of Appleshot, who works with Michael Road at the Center for Performance and Civic Practice. He's a member of the We Shall Overcome Fund Advisory Board at the Highlander Center for Research and Education. He's a steering committee member of the Arts and Culture Social Justice Network, and he's twice visited the White House to advise President Obama's administration on issues of cultural policy. Carlton also recently gave the opening address at the Grantmakers in the Arts 2015 Racial Equity Forum, and you can watch that online. It's one of the most incredibly inspiring and challenging calls to action I've ever seen. And it's an example of how Carlton, in his work, demonstrates and enacts the power of performance and arts in pressing for transformative social change. Please join me in welcoming Carlton.
Thank you. Good evening. So I want to start with, can you hear me? So I want to start with a moment of silence And the moment of silence is not in reference to anything other than the fact that we live in a world that is constantly in motion, that is constantly chattering, and we are on the receiving end of information 12 times infinity the amount that we can actually absorb. So I want to take a minute for us to cleanse our palate and just sit in silence and recognize that there's a lot for us to learn in silence. I want to honor the indigenous nations that inhabited these lands before the arrival of Columbus. And this particular space was the Cherokee and the Shawnee. Who am I? My name is Carlton Turner. I am, first and foremost, the son of Emmett, Arnold Turner, and Julie Turner. Emmett was Harlem-born, jazz. My mother, fifth generation Mississippi, rural Mississippi, the first of her lineage to go to college and receive a degree, received several. And they met in New York as my mother was traveling to the north, right at the end of the Great Migration. And we returned just a few years later in the first wave of the remigration. So we moved back from New York to Mississippi in the early 70s. I am the grandson of F.C. Roberts, this is my mother's mother, beautiful woman, and Samuel Roberts, that's my granddad. And he, along with my father, were their central male role models in my life. And this is country folk. These are good country folk. They taught me how to eat, live, and be good. And this is the first organic farmer that I knew. Before that, I was trendy. And he was the first conservationist that I knew. He cared about the land and the ecosystem, and it was a part of the way that he understood his relationship to the world. This is my grandmother standing, and that's my mother standing next to her. My two uncles, Uncle Sammy, Uncle Wes, and I think that's my Aunt Nellie in her arms. And this is the church that my great-grandfather built that I grew up in to celebrate his 149th anniversary. And it sits in my grandmother's front yard, and that's where I grew up. So there was not another house for miles around. So literally, it was my grandmother's house, the church, and the cemetery. So we learned a lot about who we were. Next. Page Grove Missionary Baptist Church. This is my grandmother and my mother. Such beautiful, these are beautiful people. And my grandfather, this is my great-grandfather, my grandmother's father, Willie Soap Broadwater. Willie Soap Broadwater was, they called him Soap because every time you saw him, slide. This is my grandfather's father, Will Roberts, and he's, I don't know exactly what was going on with him at that moment. What I do know is that this is his land, and this is the land he lived on, and he took care of his family. Next slide. This is my great-great-grandparents on my grandmother's side, maternal side. Alice Kidd and Will Broadway. And I never met them, but they're beautiful people too. Next slide. And this is my great-great-grandfather on my grandfather's side, James Roberts. And I can't remember her name, I can never remember her name. Next. And this is me. It's my son, Jonathan, 17 years old, my daughter, Carlton Turner, who's 9, my wife, Brandy. And they are my foundation. I wouldn't be able to do what I do without that group. Next. And that's my mother. She started chopping cotton at the age of 5. And that's my brother, Maurice. And we took her back to the cotton field, and we took these pictures because we wanted to show that we have endured through all that was thrown at us. This is Mississippi. This is who we are. And you can't run away from that. That is a part of who we are. Next slide. This is my brother, Maurice. Go back, there we go. And we have a group called Men and Guidance Active for Early Extinction. And this picture is in a field not far from our house. And it's a cotton field with a Civil War replica of it's lined up, all of these cannons. It's a military park. And every so often we have these Civil War reenactments. That is their culture. That's where they come from. That's what they understand.
In Vicksburg?
Not far from Vicksburg, yeah, but this is in Raymond. You can go through next slide. These are a few projects that we've done with the August Wilson Center, Rise Raising Black Men, the Burning Progress Theater, where I performed with that group. And this is a project called Race Peace. You can stay here for a second. Race Peace is a collaboration that we do with a group called Mondo Bizarro and Junebug Productions in New Orleans. And it basically is our opportunity to develop a system for using art and culture to talk about, unpack, and build on issues of race and racism and how it impacts our personal and interpersonal relationships. But this is what it looks like when we're talking about race. It doesn't have to be doom and gloom. You know, when you can embody a practice and you can put it into your body and allow it to be the form of expression in which you detail your narrative and your understanding of where you locate yourself in this understanding of race and racism in a world that we didn't build, but that we are all the products of. This type of practice allows us to have that conversation in a very different way than the way that it should be held. Next slide. And these are just some slides of that. We're going to go to just hold it for a second. So I wanted to start there because you need to know a little bit about me and who I am and where I come from to have a context for how I approach the work. So, starting with my family, starting with the people that I love, that have always loved me, that continue to hold me and keep me in their regards, and always have the best intentions for me, is the way that I approach the world. And so it's important to understand that very basic ideology. So we're going to talk a second about culture. Culture is the emotional, intellectual, spiritual, and material attributes of a people. It's very important to understand. Intellectual, emotional, spiritual, material. So, and these are my definitions. These are definitions that I borrow from places where I think they resonate with me. If you don't share these definitions, that's fine. What I'm going to be sharing tonight is my ideas and thoughts, and then we can have conversations about how that resonates with you. I don't expect you to agree with everything that I say here, but it's my story, my narrative, and that's the place that I have to interface with this group. So I wanted for us to take a second to think about the words that we use, the language that we use. These words are culture. Culture gets thrown around a lot, like a lot of words. We use so many words in our daily lives that we forget how much weight words carry. And we use them with abandon. We use them recklessly. We often use them without any sense of what they really mean. And we often think that we're talking about the same thing when we use the same word, but usually we're not. Because that word, no matter what the definition is, it comes with a cultural context, for whatever way you enter your understanding. And so we throw these words around, and I want to bring up a few words that show up a lot. You can go to the next slide. So these words have been showing up a lot. And what I wanted us to do, and we're not going to do it because we originally had people out around the tables, so I really wanted people inside to sit a little closer, but I wanted to challenge us to think about explaining these words to a 5-year-old. You have to choose your words really carefully, because most of the nuances and all of the extra flowery language that we learn to embellish our sentences with and language and use this mighty language that we call English often don't really convey the message that we're trying to get across. So the definitions that I'm about to share are the definitions that I would share with the 5-year-old. This is not to belittle anyone in this room. So diversity means having variety, having different types of things. Equality means equal measure. 50 on this side, 50 on this side. Inclusion means allowing access. You can go there, you can be a part of that, you're included. None of them mean that it's right or wrong. It's a measurement, it's an identifier of things. But this next word, equity, means justice. Simple and plain, it's justice. So when we talk about equity, when I talk about equity, when I use these words throughout this piece, I'm talking about justice. So you can just kind of like put justice in the same place as equity. Cultural equity, if we go back and think about the emotional, intellectual, physical, and spiritual attributes of people, and think about what does that look like when justice is applied to it, is what cultural equity is. So cultural equity it creates a space for the development of a pluralistic society, because all cultures have an equitable state and are treated with justice. Culture is greater than art. And I know arts folks are like, it's always about the art. But culture is essential to human communication, development, and health. And although it contains art, art is not in and of itself a thing. Art is only an identifier of the culture that it represents. So, by experiencing art, what we're experiencing is a cultural communication. It's communicating the culture from which it grows and divulges from. That's what we're experiencing when we're experiencing art. We're experiencing the culture that it comes from and is informed by. See, the traditional role of people that we now call artists, before artists were invented, was a role that was to help a community geospatially locate itself in time and understand its history and its future, to be able to celebrate the birth of children, the passing of elders, the marriage of two, the communion of people, to celebrate and identify religious moments and spiritual moments, to aid you in understanding the seasons. It was an identifier and a place. It helped you to hold your place and understanding where you were at any moment. And these are what we call culture bearers. These were the people who held the fabric of the culture together. And they weren't special people. Like, they weren't people who lived on the hill from the village. You know, they were in the village with everybody else because they had a job to do, and that job was to keep time. So the relationship between, so what happens when we think about cultural equity, we think about culture, we think about this being the justice applied to culture, we move to this place of understanding that there's a relationship between cultural equity and public policy. And I want to unpack that a little bit. See, whose work gets validated and valued shapes public opinion. I often think about, I used to work at this big entertainment complex, and all of my bosses were rednecks. And I mean that like in the truest sense of the word. They were like straight up Mississippi racist Dixiecrat rednecks. And it was real, it was sad, because their understanding of where they were in this moment was based on a lie. And so I worked for them. And me being who I am, never let an opportunity pass to engage in thoughtful intellectual conversation. And so I remember when we were beginning to invade Iraq for the second time. And one of the owners of the big complex, he was standing there looking at the TV. He had like 48 TVs in the building. And he said, what we ought to do is just nuke them to death. And I was like, have you ever been to Iraq? And he said, no, we discussed. I said, well, do you know any people from Iraq? He was like, no. He was proud to not know anybody from Iraq. I said, well, do you know anybody who's ever been to Iraq? Have you ever read anything about Iraq? So you're basing your entire premise of bombing a culture out of existence on what you see on television, by no experience and no connection to these people. I got fired 3 weeks later. It was all for the better, because I didn't, I don't think they needed me there, and I definitely didn't need to do that. But I think what's important is to understand that there's a connection between the faces and the stories that we see on film and on television, and the way that people are portrayed, and what we see on the walls and galleries, and what we see when we go to the theater, who's on the stage, who gets to sing, who's in the spotlight. All of these things shape how we think about each other. So we can't relegate the stage to being an unimportant fixture in cultural development. What happens is the power of personal narrative shapes public policy. So who gets a chance to tell their story? Who only has their story told by observers or third persons? So for me, thinking about the motives that are behind national and global economic policy making is tied to the acquisition and accumulation and possession of power, right? So thinking back to how you can frame, and when I think about framing, I'm like, okay, framing. How do you frame a culture? How do you frame an individual? Like police will frame you by putting cocaine in your possession, different things. But how does a media or an arts landscape frame the other? What is the frame that they put around those that don't have the power and privilege to tell their own story? So who gets funded to support their work? Whose work gets awarded by the Kennedy Center or the National Endowment for the Arts or the National whatever, or the big grant for this year, or even the local city grant? Who gets those awards and is allowed and created space for it to tell their story impacts how we think about our neighbors? Think about that for a moment. So a lot of this is about establishing norms. We have to think about examining the power dynamics of who controls the systems of valuation and validation. If as an artist, my work has received the MacArthur Genius Award, I wouldn't have a problem getting that little grant from the local arts commission validation because now I've been validated at one of the very highest levels. So our institutions and how we give and who gets funded is a way to validate and place doubt on the products that we produce. So why do we even need a valuation system or validation system? I want to go back a little bit. The doctrine of discovery. Who knows about the doctrine of discovery? Wow. The doctrine of discovery. The process by which European colonizers used Christianity to justify the confiscation and ownership of indigenous land and territories, and by default, their displacement. These lands and territories were governed by the native and indigenous peoples that practiced and were grounded in their own spiritual belief system. They were subsequently forbidden from practicing those spiritual practices, the practices that had kept their communities together for thousands of years. So in this moment, press forward, see where we are. We're talking about the birth of the artist, and how we get to the birth of the artist is understanding that the doctrine of discovery is what was used to justify the rape, enslavement, murder, and the attempt to erase entire cultural practices and heritages and people. Right? So that's what was used. So the doctrine of discovery, which is still in practice, and it allows a European group of colonizers to come to a land that is inhabited by civilized people that have an established governing system, that have, running, whatever the systems that are running that are not savage, they're different. They're different from what you're doing. That allows you, because they're not practicing the things the same way that your culture practices them. You've established a norm that you're making a measurement and decision and validation and valuation and marginalization of anything that is other. Right? So we see this happening now. The governor of Maine talks about Tyrone and Smoothie coming up to Maine and infesting his community with drugs and getting his white women pregnant and then running back to their ghetto slums. This is 2016. Right? Coded language. Right? So I'll get back to that. Separation of art from cultural practice. That is this establishing cultural norms. That is this valuation and validation. This is the ability to say that this thing that these folks are doing is more important than what these other folks are doing. And it needs to be supported at a different level. So we're going to give more money to this community because it is promoting the thing that we think is the most important. These are decisions and these are valuations that are governing our lives. So the indigenous peoples were forced off their land, severing their spiritual and ancestral connection to their identity, prohibited from engaging in any of the cultural practices that help to locate themselves in a geospatial nonlinear time. Their hair was cut. They were forbidden to wear their traditional attire, their rituals, or their speaking of their native languages. They were put into boarding schools and conditioned out of their cultural practice. So when you lose your cultural practice, you're not only losing the artifacts and the art and the beautiful things that you painted and the headdress, and you're losing your history. You're losing your ancestral power and spirit, which is locked up in your language. Because your language is completely different than the language of the people that you're engaging with. So there's a translation that isn't happening because you think when I'm saying community and you say community, we think we're talking about the same thing. But we're not. Because the cultural context that defines and emboldens my understanding of community is completely different from your cultural context. So Africans were not allowed to read or write. Their families were separated, their native languages ripped from their mouths, their women and children raped, their spiritual reference to the sacred space destroyed. There was a prohibition on anything African. So your music, your language, your understanding of who you are was completely erased. Not because they thought that they were giving you something that was better than you. but because they knew that the moment that they could separate the community from its culture, then it puts the community in the most vulnerable space ever. Because you have no direction, your compass has been broken. The one thing that helps to guide you to understand what to do in moments of distress, what to do when babies are ready to be born, what to do when it's time to get married, all that stuff disrupted in the name of a power grab. See, this is where it gets really tricky because we think that these things only apply to brown people. But there's not a white person in this room. Not one. Everybody in here has a cultural heritage that the system demanded you disown to take on the national whites. And so what does that mean for you? Because you're suffering from racism too. How does that change the way that you interact and interface and understand your geospatial location? Everything becomes a commodity. Bought and sold, traded on the market. And so this is where we are. So what happens when the only thing left for that energy that used to be the celebratory energy, or the energy that was the mourning energy, or the energy that was the festive, what becomes of that energy? Because the energy can't be taken away. Only the conduit by which it gets channeled. So those energies for the celebration become, jazz. It becomes that mourning, it becomes the blues and hymns. That drum becomes tap dancing. You can't change it, but see what happens is that now those things can only be done in the service of the master. So you have reduced a community that is culturally located to being slaves to an entertainment industry. And that's how art responds to free market capitalism. It's no longer a cultural practice. It's a cultural commodity that anybody can possess. So you don't know when you're going down the street and you hear rap music, whether it's going to be a black kid with his pants sagging or an Asian kid from Korea doing breakdancing. You don't know because it's no longer connected in that same way. We can't talk about free market capitalism and global capitalism without understanding its connection to the exploitation of human labor and resources, community resources. The creation of the U.S. economy is based entirely on the free labor of enslaved Africans imported to this country and bred for generations to supply a workforce that was considered property of the ruling class. Human potential is being squandered globally by the push for economic wealth and power over resources. Resources that belong to a planet that cannot be owned, merely momentarily occupied, is being exploited in the same way that the large majority of its inhabitants are. This is our culture. This is the culture that we share. But it can be reshaped and transformed. There was one of the challenges that we have in this issue around arts and free market capitalism is that it creates for us this false dichotomy between community engaged artists and professional, right? Because the professional has had a valuation placed on their product that places their product more in a space more important than those that are doing work that is engaging and bringing about change in their community. Which is, to me, is closer to the natural position of what we call an artist in relation to his community. Cultural equity means that the culture of individualism and personal achievement can't be more pervasive than the culture of collective action in human being. Cultural equity looks like validating the means of cultural production and not just the ends. Activating language because in the words we find the keys to our identity and liberation. In the words being spoken exists the spirit of our ancestors and their collective strength. So we move into a space of trying to find how do we have critical discourse about the role and the state of our society. This is why we have arts institutions. It is the place where we should be going to understand that transition between community and public policy. It should be the place where we go to see things that challenge our understanding of who we are, our identity, and how we interact with society. But those things have not been valued. So those things get relegated to the margins. So when we go to the movies, you have to wait every 8 years for Spike Lee to make a movie to see a black-centered theme. Or you have to wait, that once-in-a-lifetime movie that is written, directed, and starred in. Do you see the connection between these things? Do you understand that the same issues that we cry about that have not been fixed in our arts industry, diversity, inclusion, equality, equity, they're the same issues that haven't been fixed in our communities, in our societies? How can we expect the arts community to be immune to the disease of racism and patriarchy and imperialism and colonialization? How can we expect arts to be outside of that paradigm when arts is the closest thing to resembling a timepiece for who we are in our evolution as a species? So when we think about the work that we're doing, we have to understand that we have to have, as regular people, we have to have agency in the decisions that most directly impact our lives. And that's the place where I think we can change. Arts institutions can be cultural hubs that help to monitor equity and the transition from cultural practice and public discourse into policies that promote public health. So I want to challenge you to think about your work as artists, as people in the arts industry, in any industry that you're working in, because this translates across every industry that we have that impacts our lives. What are you doing to shift our collective culture? Because we're in trouble, right? If this is the direction that we're all going at full speed, then we can kind of see where we end up, right? We've seen what the impacts of climate change have been just over the last 50, 60 years. What happens when that is allowed to go out 7 generations? What happens when we allow corporate interests to control every idea that is presented on TV and film in the newspapers? It's controlled it goes back to 2 or 3 groups that are controlled by white men, with a very narrow perspective about what the possibilities are for change. Because the perspective is based on a very narrow understanding of culture. Because if it's not this, then it's that. And that's not part of this. The problem is that this is running the world. So as artists, as culture workers, we have an opportunity. We have a job. It's to question, interrogate, and challenge any and all institutions that were built on the foundational principle of destruction. When you build a country that is based on a premise that its natural inhabitants are less than human, that the Africans that you enslaved, kidnapped, and brought here are only 60% human, then every institution that you build on top of that foundational principle has to be questioned. Not a single institution can get by without saying, well, the education system works, well, the healthcare system works, well, the financial system is working, well, our democracy is working. Ain't nothing working. Because if it ain't working for everybody, it ain't working for nobody. And so we get very much, we get lax. So we're like, I'm good, I'm good, I've got a job to go to, But there's lessons about that. If you wait till it gets to your doorstep, it's already too late. Right? So we can see what's happening. We see what's happening all around the world. We see what's happening to our Muslim brothers and sisters that live right down the street. We see what's happening to our black brothers and sisters that are being killed in the street by the police. We see it. But it hasn't moved us to a place of urgency to where that becomes the thing that moves us to action, that moves us to making decisions, that moves us to strategize, that moves us to organize, that moves us to think about what role do I play? How am I being seen? What is my role in this moment? You know, I think black folks talk about what I would have did in slavery. You know, what? Oh man, not me. Well, what you doing now? What you doing now? It's just slavery in a different name. I know people don't want to hear that. They don't like to hear. They don't like to make those connections between the basic atrocities that started this ripple that is it's America. So how do we begin to shift these ideas? How do we begin to change the way that we think about our relationship to each other? And when will it be enough for us to honor each other's humanity, see each other as full human beings, and begin to go into every moment and every aspect and every facet of your life with the love for those people next to you that you have for your mother or your grandmother or your husband or your father? What will it take for us to love each other unconditionally and with a radical type of love that allows us to take care of each other? We're not separate. Some of us get treated differently, but we're all human beings. And the role of the artist is to help us find out who we are. The role of the arts institution is to be, like ground zero for the investigation of who we are. And so when we talk about this work, when we talk about equity, this is a lifelong pursuit. You don't stop work. You don't stop this job till you die. That's when you clock out. How many of us are ready to take that time to our work? It's a lot of work, and I forgot. I don't remember. We just keep on going. I just want to get to So I want to end with this because this is why I do what I do. Right? That's my daughter, Carlton Turner, with her bunny ears on. She's brilliant. She's smarter now than I ever was, right? At 9, she's smarter than I am now. And that's saying a lot. I want to end with this. I'm done. I just want one more picture. I want to show this last picture. These are my country babies. And that's in front of the same church that you saw the earlier picture from. In my grandmother's yard. These are all family. This is all family, folks. But I think it's important to recognize that this is why we do what we do, so that they don't have to struggle with the same things that we struggle with. That we don't pass on this legacy of ignorance, of dehumanization, of war and destruction, of violence, whether it be state-sponsored or sponsored by dad, or big brother or sister. We can't pass that on. This is our opportunity to be the generation that did, instead of being the generation that, allowed it to go past it. But it takes all of us taking this work very seriously. I want to give a shout out to my guy, Michael, playing in the back. And just tell a quick story. Michael was I met Michael a long time ago at the University of Mississippi, where I received my education in institutionalized diversity. Michael was my advisor. And I quit school. And Michael thought he would fail. Michael had talked to me for a while. But I told him that he didn't fail, that he did a great job. Because I understood that what that institution had to teach me, I already learned. And the things that I needed to learn, that institution couldn't teach me. And I couldn't wait for them to validate me, for me to go and do the things that I need to do to validate myself. Thanks, man. Thank you.
I'd like to open up the floor to discussion. If there are anything people want to say or questions that they want to
bring out after that incredible discussion. Michael?
I made it just a little late because I got lost, but my question is, the 90s, we were in Jackson, everybody was artists and trying to transcend being an independent artist, but still remaining true to culture as much as possible. Looking back now on that situation, what advice do you give, let's say, the group of artists that were in Jackson, or the people who now are independent artists, who are not necessarily trying to be a part of the machine, but want to make change happen? I think you probably covered that in the whole lecture, but in a nutshell, because I missed a lot of it, what do you say?
Well, I think first and foremost, I have to put a plug in for AlternateROOTS, because that's where I got that question answered. Personally, as an artist, AlternateROOTS is a 40-year-old arts service organization that was founded at the Highlander Center in 1976, and it was founded to basically understand how artists were approaching the problems of the South, and where they were using their art as a language to kind of like contextualize the time period, which was the late 70s. And what they created was a participatory democracy in which the artists that were being served by the organization were the ones who were also making the decisions about how the organization ran, how it spent its resources, and what it did and how it developed itself. It was a radical democracy then. It's a radical democracy now, but it was even more radical there in the 70s, and for it to continue to live. What it taught me was that there's definitely this space in which you, as an artist, are trying to reach into those spaces to be validated, right? And validation comes in a lot of different forms. It comes in getting a job, like having work and getting paid to do your art. It also comes from validation by the way that you're able to interact with the lives of other people. What Roots helped me to understand was that I can't put the artistry in front of the culture. Like, I have to establish my identity and establish my voice as an artist to be an impactful artist. Like, if I'm just moving into a place in which the art and the drive toward the market forces, then I get shaped and molded into whatever the market needs. But if I establish my voice and identity as an artist first, and recognize that that work is informed by the culture that raised me and the culture that I'm immersing myself in, then if you do that work good, other work will come. Because people will see the work that you're doing and be like, okay, can you help? I'd love for you to be and bring some of that vibe and some of that context over here. And so that was the organization that helped me understand that I could be an artist doing the work that I do and not be Mississippi and not have to leave my home, and be in service to the people that mean the most to me because they're the people that I'm most invested in, and also be in service to the furthering of these ideas that are helping to shape the evolution of humanity.
I feel like there's been a little bit of a loss in the sense of art as a means of social change. I mean, I talked to my mother who grew up in Depression and Brooklyn and all this, and I described her as being a little left of Fidel Castro, but that's that she would talk about Liff and John Steinbeck, these great artists that were really trying to write social justice through their art. And it seems on a major, these were mainstream artists, they're dead. And I wonder if we've lost a little bit of that mainstream artists can't reach into that popular at this point.
Well, I think it's the control. I mean, back then you had 1,000 radio stations that all control their own playlists. And now you've got 3 that all have to play the same thing. And they're all owned by, it's like when you're constantly gobbling up industry, when Burt's Bees is owned by Estee Lauder, it's like it ceases to be, I don't know if that's wrong, but it's not owned by Burt. I think the market has dictated that. The market has dictated how socially relevant you can be. And I think that has produced more independent people. There's more artists doing social change work now than ever in the history of time. But they don't own any of the media outlets. So there's no avenue for you to learn about that and have that to be a part of our critical discourse. If you don't know, you don't know.
Well, we have 500 channels plus the internet.
Everybody doesn't have internet.
Well, no, it's cheaper to get it to computers.
But that doesn't mean anything. It's negligible in the grand scheme of being able to show, what's this guy's name? Singer from Hawaii. Bruno Mars. Bruno Mars, during the Super Bowl, broke the records of anybody performing live and being seen by people simultaneously throughout the world. With that one performance, he was broadcast on every station throughout the world. He broke the record in people that were able to see a live experience and have that experience together. But if Bruno wanted to get up there and say something socially relevant, he would have never been there, right? And so the power that is invested in these mechanisms is still controlled and owned. These are not places for public discourse. These are places to be fed information. And that's the difference. And we have to understand that I think that's the difference from the age that you're talking about. There was more independent control over media. It still wasn't, democratized fully, but it was still more opportunity. And that doesn't exist today.
Well, it's what happened with the Dixie Chicks. The Dixie Chicks were a perfect example of that. They got up, they stated their political opinion, and then they were banned from radio.
Right.
I had a question for me. You kind of touched on it earlier, and what I personally struggle with in my book and development, trying to see a difference in African American community. How do you try to change something, an image that's so powerful? When you yourself is not getting hot, cool, and negative. Because when there's the most successful artists speaking about so many negative things, and the kids raising that, and you come in and say, well, it's not the only one. So how do you even start?
Yeah, I think it starts with relationship building. Because that's all it is. I mean, it's relationship building. You start with being the image that you want to portray, that you want to see. That's the only way you can start. You can't start by giving people what you think they want to hear or telling people what not to listen to. Like with my 17-year-old son, he doesn't think I'm cool. All his friends think I'm cool. You know what I'm saying? But for him, I ask him, I said, so what you listening to? And so I'll go and I'll listen to it, and I'll be like, okay, so let's talk. Let's unpack that a little bit. I'm not gonna tell you can't listen to that. Because in that moment, it's like for him, he's gonna hear me clear if we can have some critical discourse. This is the point of it is critical discourse. I'm not telling anybody how to live your life. I'm saying when there's no choice, you can only do this thing. And what cultural equity means is that we have then a choice of traditions, of practices that we can pull from, that we can engage in, that make us feel whole. And that's, so you start where you are. You start in the community. I know there's some young person that you walk past every day. That's where you start. Every day. It's work. It's everyday work.
First of all, thank you again. Express enough how on point your messaging. I feel like you hear different pieces and it's just really nice. Thank you for coming back to me. My question is, I guess, two-part. Talk about some of your family. Who were some of the great teachers in your life who would help you kind of formulate your vision and passion? And I guess part two would be, how can we, as employees and advocates, make it easier for those types of relationships to form?
Well, I'll say this, I've been thoroughly blessed with amazing influences and people that surround myself. So, definitely my mother and father, amazing influences. My father really infused us with a lot of different cultural ideas as young people, mostly through jazz. And for us, jazz was an opportunity to unlock the radical expression. Like, I didn't even get to the science. Like, we just talked about the art, but like art, there's a science to every art, right? And so jazz in itself, the way that it works, and the mathematics behind jazz, literally was breaking the shackles of slavery. Like that's what it did to the mind. Because it created this space in your mind to be able to understand complex polyrhythmic, phrasing that was very much African in its origin, but very much American in the expression. And so there's a science behind this stuff. So that's part of it. But I think my grandfather, all those people that you see are influences, And then I've been really blessed to have an artistic origin and lineage that I've been able to sit at the feet of people like John O'Neill, Free Southern Theater, Linda Paris Bailey, the Carpetbag Theater, and Joe Carson, and Kathy Donato, Bob Leonard, Dudley Cobb, and Bob Moses, and just so many, Dr. Bernice Johnson Reagan. I mean, like these are people that I've spent a lot of time with that, they taught me, they helped me to understand how to be responsible for my community and to be a responsible artist. And the values that and these aren't perfect people. None of these people are perfect. I'm not perfect. There's no perfect person in the world. These are all people who had to struggle with the same challenges that we're having to struggle with. And they made the decision to dedicate not just their art, but their lives to shifting and bringing about cultural transformation. And so that's, Hollis Watkins. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. I mean, we could rattle off Kalama Yasalam. I mean, Nasa's been a big influence. Tafar, I mean, it's so many people that have been a part of my cultural shaping. And I think that's just one of the benefits of being an artist. You just get the chance to spend time with some amazing people.
But I just want to know what your feelings are now as you see the world expanding to us, the information widening to us in terms of moving the art movement, the African American art movement, to an African diasporic movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I appreciate you. Thank you for the information. I think the struggle is a global struggle, completely. It's an international struggle. I think the reason why that there's still a fixation with slavery in that history of the United States is because slavery is a contemporary issue. It's not an issue that has a time that is past. It is translated and transformed into different ways to exist. But slavery is still very much alive and well in the United States, and the people who are most impacted by that are Black and brown people. And so I think that there's work to do in the here and now. I think we have to kind of understand slavery in a contemporary context. It's not the past, and we talk about it as if there's not 2 million, folks incarcerated. More than any developed nation, far higher than our per capita, population. And those people have lost all rights. They're no longer citizens. They're property of the state. But we're able to dehumanize those individuals because the world has told us, and the media has told us that those are criminals. They belong behind bars. They're bad people. And so you can go to jail for 35 years and steal a rack of ribs, but if you fleece the Americans' pocketbooks of billions of dollars, you never see a day in court. Those are the same rules that slavery operated under. And so we can't relegate slavery to a historic topic. I don't know if that answers your question, but I think the impact of all those places you talked about, Italy, Africa, Australia, they're all dealing with this same issue. Because the same people did to them what they did to the indigenous people of this continent. You understand what I'm saying? So this is not, when we talk about slavery in America, it's talking about slavery in the world. It's talking about the commodification of bodies, with the highest values being placed on Black and brown bodies in terms of in a market-based system. So there's language and there's history for us to understand that places us in a global and international historical context. And that was during a time where you could go to different places in the world and find different cultural practices. But everywhere in the world right now operates under global capitalism. Even places like China and Russia that say they're not capitalists operate under capitalism. So how do we interface with that conversation? How do we understand those issues and dynamics in other international forums? I think the best way to do it is to understand our context where we are at this moment. But that's not to dismiss any of that information or relegate it to the side. It's to say that all of that is part of the same informational bank that we need to shift this into a different situation. Capitalism cannot exist without exploitation. It can't exist without hierarchies. It demands a permanent second class. I mean, those are some jacked up rules. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, if the only way we can have a capitalist structure is that there's gotta be somebody that's always gonna be the servants. You can choose who it's gonna be. You know what I'm saying? But, you know, I'm sure that the people that are choosing, that the person that gets chosen ain't part of that discussion. So these are big issues. This is about these, you know, and none of us decided to make the world this way. I don't think we have any like global capitalism. But, you know, none of us make these decisions, but we're all dealing with the ramifications of what that type of structure means to the way we interface with the world and life. Just someone.
We seem to be a lot more consumers of art in this society than creators of it. And I'm curious if you would maybe bring any new ideas about getting more of the society to be creators of art. And not necessarily on a professional level, but like in African cultures where the whole society, you know, you're dancing, you're singing, you're storytelling, it's just part of your life. What are some fresh ideas on pulling that back into our society now?
Go home.
Adult education.
Yeah.
Go home. Go home. I mean, all that stuff you're talking about is still happening where I live. Like, people don't get together without singing and telling stories and dancing. Like, it ain't gotta be nothing special. You know, when you throw some college women together with some catfish and, you know, start playing some cards, there's gonna be some storytelling, there's gonna be some laughing, there's gonna be some dancing, there's gonna be the invoking of ancestral spirits. That's culture. It ain't nothing special. Artists ain't nothing special.
But I think you have a unique family. So
No, I don't. I don't by any means. I don't.
Say something. One of the most profound artistic experiences I ever had was at the Museum of Natural History in New York, with Ice Age Art. I came across a bone sculpture from 30,000 BC, Ice Age. And all I could do was stand there and look at it. I think this was somebody in a cave or a hut or whatever, trying to represent their reality. Trying to get across to, there were no markets at the time, there were no big sale on this. You know, probably whoever was the spouse said, when you leave that alone, go out and kill something, you eat it. So it's...
Or not.
Right.
Because what else were you doing?
Right. But that's the point of that, is that if you take a moment to represent your reality as it is, in a given moment, then you're doing marketing.
One more question.
Actually,
One question and this one.
no, I was gonna say, I was just gonna point, I know she's been waiting a while, young lady.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My question is regarding the digital inclusion question. There was a lot of information. This information, that information, and a lot of you don't have access to this information. And so I'm wondering what the artist's role in helping people access that information is. And that's my question.
There's tons and tons and tons of information. It's more information we can never process as a human being, right? So part of the challenge was to how do you sift through all of the stuff that's out there to find what can be meaningful to you in your life and what your pursuit is. And as artists, I think our job is to be able to translate in multiple languages. And so that's taking whatever experiences that you're engaged, that you embody. When you get that information, your job is to pass it on to folks who don't have that information, if you deem that information to be important to their advancement. And so that is all of our roles. That's not an artistic role. That is a role of like people that care about you. They're gonna tell you the information that you need to know. You know, you ever get that text that says, hey, there's a roadblock up on 18, you know, so just be careful when you're coming home tonight. Anybody else get that? I get that. You know, but that's sharing of information and using technology to benefit society, not just, you know, just for the sake of technology. You know, like right now, technology is guiding us versus our intentions as a people guiding the way technology is used and developed. And so we can't put the genie back in the bottle. We can't reverse having all this access and having all these technological advances. But what we can do is set parameters in terms of how that stuff engages and influences our lives and how it's developed to support health in a public way.
I mean, is there an artistic role in getting that technology into oppressed communities?
You know, I think that's a community's role.
Okay.
And you know, I don't think, you know, again, I'll say this again, artists are not special people. Artists are just like everybody else. They're just people who have either developed and tuned their creative spirit, or people who've been trained to hone that space. But everybody has the ability to create. It's something that is endowed in every human being. It's part of our DNA. It's part of our genealogy. It's not a person that can play music. You know, some people have a quicker adaptation to using that creativity, but everybody has the ability.
That is the perfect place for us to wrap this up. Thank you so much.